In a world where power often resides in the shadows, and secrets are currency, there are those who dare to uncover what others would rather keep hidden. Elisa Martinez, a dedicated and unyielding journalist, had spent years chasing stories that most would never dare touch. But when she stumbled upon a trail of corruption that led straight to the heart of the police force, Elisa unknowingly crossed into dangerous territory. At first, it seemed like just another story. A few crooked cops, a few whispered rumors. But as Elisa dug deeper, she uncovered a network of deceit so vast, so intertwined with the very system that was supposed to protect the public, that the stakes became immeasurably higher. What Elisa didn't know was that she wasn't just going after corrupt officers. She was taking on an empire, one built on fear, manipulation, and control. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the truth would cost her everything. But Elisa had made a choice. She would fight no matter the personal cost. The battle for justice was never going to be easy, and Elisa knew the risks. But in her heart she understood one fundamental truth. No matter how dangerous the fight, no matter how high the price, truth was worth it. The question was, how much would she have to sacrifice to see it through? The moon hung low over the quiet streets as Elisa Montero drove home, her thoughts tangled in the cases she had been working on. As a prosecutor, she was used to long days and sleepless nights, but something about the silence of this evening felt heavier than usual. The soft hum of her engine was the only sound until the sudden blare of sirens cut through the stillness. A police cruiser pulled up behind her, its lights flashing red and blue. Elisa's heart skipped a beat as she pulled to the side of the road. She had no reason to be afraid. She wasn't speeding, her papers were in order, but the weight of history pressed down on her. As a black woman, she had learned long ago that routine stops were rarely routine. Her fingers trembled as she rolled down the window, and the sharp beam of a flashlight immediately blinded her. "License and registration," barked a voice, harsh and cold. Elisa complied, handing over her documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. The officer ignored her question, turning instead to his partner. "Looks like another one of those cases," he muttered, loud enough for Elisa to hear. The situation quickly spiraled. Accusations flew, claims that her taillight was broken, that her car matched the description of a stolen vehicle. Elisa protested calmly, explaining her position, but the officers seemed to grow more hostile with each word. When they demanded she step out of the car, she hesitated, and that hesitation was all they needed. "Step out now or we'll make you." Elisa was pulled roughly from her seat, her protests drowned out by the officers' accusations. They frisked her aggressively, searching her car without cause, their laughter and mocking comments stinging her pride. She tried to remind them of her rights, but they weren't listening. They didn't see a prosecutor, an educated woman. They saw only their own assumptions. By the time the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Elisa's anger had melted into a numb disbelief. She was pushed into the back of the cruiser, her heart pounding as the doors slammed shut. She stared out at the darkened streets, wondering how something so ordinary had become a nightmare. Hours passed in the cold, fluorescent-lit room of the police station. Elisa sat alone, her wrists aching from the tight cuffs. Every time she tried to explain who she was, her words were met with condescension or outright dismissal. The officers processed her arrest as if she were a common criminal, their smirks and whispers adding insult to injury. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the monotony. A new figure entered the room, a senior officer with a stern expression. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Elisa. "What's going on here?" he demanded. One of the officers stepped forward, clearly uneasy. "We caught her in a suspicious vehicle, sir." She resisted. "She's the prosecutor for the state," the senior officer interrupted, his voice sharp. "Release her immediately." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged nervous glances as the weight of their mistake sank in. Elisa was uncuffed without a word of apology, her dignity bruised but intact. As she gathered her belongings, she overheard one officer muttering to his partner. "She should have told us who she was from the start. Would have saved everyone trouble." Lisa froze. The comment stung more than she expected. It wasn't about her credentials or her status. It was about the blatant racism and abuse of power she had just endured. Even if she hadn't been a prosecutor, she deserved better. Driving home in the early morning light, Elisa's thoughts were heavy. She replayed the night's events, each moment sharpening her resolve. The falsified charges on the arrest report, the humiliation she had endured, none of it could go unanswered. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. By the time she parked in her driveway, Elisa had made her decision. She would take a stand even if it cost her everything. The decision was made. Elisa woke up the next morning with a sense of urgency coursing through her veins. She couldn't ignore what had happened, not just to her, but to so many others who hadn't had the privilege of fighting back. The hours spent in the station, the demeaning treatment, and the false accusations gnawed at her. It was time to act, but where to start? Elisa reached for her phone and immediately called Anna, her assistant. Anna had worked with Elisa for over 5 years, and the two had become more than colleagues. They were a team bound by a shared commitment to justice. Anna, Elisa began, her voice low but determined. We need to start documenting everything. I'm taking action against these officers. Anna's response was immediate, her concern for Elisa's safety clear. Are you sure about this? You know how much power they have and what it could mean for you personally? Elisa exhaled slowly, already bracing herself for the backlash. I know. But if I don't do something, nothing will change. I'm going to take this public. The thought of going public wasn't easy. Elisa knew it meant putting her career and even her safety on the line. But she also knew that if the system could break someone like her, it could break anyone. The people who had mocked her, humiliated her, had no idea who they were dealing with. Elisa had the training, the knowledge, and the resources to make a difference. The next step was crucial. Elisa reached out to a trusted journalist, Marcus Silva, known for his investigative work in exposing corruption. She trusted him to handle the story carefully, but she also knew that bringing him in would be a double-edged sword. The moment the story was released to the press, there would be no going back. As Elisa hung up the phone, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in days, she knew what she had to do. There would be no turning back, but that's what justice required. Elisa had always been aware of the challenges of working in a deeply flawed system, but she had never fully understood the depth of its reach until now. As soon as she filed the report, the pushback began. It wasn't subtle. The police force, knowing what was at stake, quickly began to discredit her. Her phone rang constantly, but not with support. It was anonymous calls, slurs, and threats. One morning, she found her car vandalized with racist graffiti. They were coming after her, hard. But that was only the beginning. At work, things took a darker turn. Her colleagues, many of whom she considered friends, began to distance themselves. Some avoided eye contact, others sent her worried glances, but no one spoke up in her defense. Her boss, a man she had once respected, cornered her in his office late one afternoon. Elisa, I understand your passion, but this is bigger than you, he said, his voice low. You're jeopardizing your career and ours. I'm asking you to drop the case. Her mind raced, but her response was firm. You know I can't do that. Her boss sighed. You don't know what you're getting into. This isn't just about a few bad cops. It's the system itself. You'll destroy yourself if you keep going. Elisa didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. It was the same language used to silence those who dared to expose the ugly truths. She wasn't going to back down now. The more resistance she faced, the stronger her resolve grew. But it wasn't just the professional pushback that stung. It was the isolation. At home, her partner Marcos, who had always been supportive, now seemed distant. The pressure was getting to him too. One evening after dinner, Elisa came home to find Marcos sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. I don't want anything to happen to you, he said softly. I know, Elisa replied, sitting beside him. But I can't stop. Not now. Their eyes met and she saw the fear in his gaze. It wasn't the fear of her being wrong. It was the fear of what might happen to her. Elisa had faced many challenges in her life, but this was different. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was a battle for her very place in the world. The pressure was mounting and the stakes had never been higher. The public response to Elisa's case was swift, but not in the way she had hoped. She had expected resistance from the police force, but the backlash from the community was unexpected and more vicious than she anticipated. Social media erupted with polarized opinions. Supporters of the police painted Elisa as an opportunist, someone using her position to gain fame. They flooded her personal accounts with hate messages and threats. There were calls to revoke her law license, to destroy her credibility. On the other hand, there were voices that rallied behind her, but they were drowned out by the sheer volume of opposition. As the pressure grew, Elisa found herself becoming a symbol. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the countless others who had suffered in silence. Yet the cost of this fight was becoming increasingly evident. At the office, her credibility was slipping. During a meeting with a group of influential figures, Elisa noticed the cold stares and dismissive gestures. Her career was hanging by a thread, and her colleagues had begun to avoid speaking up in her defense. Even the allies she thought she had were slowly retreating, unwilling to face the wrath of the system. Then came the letter. It arrived one morning, slipped under the door of her office with no return address. Inside there was a single sentence written in bold red ink. "You will regret this." Elisa didn't need to ask who it was from. The message was clear. It wasn't just the police who were fighting her. It was the entire structure of power. They had made their move. But Elisa wasn't intimidated. She couldn't be. She had already sacrificed too much to back down now. And if anything, the threats only made her more determined. The fight for justice wasn't going to be easy, but she had never expected it to be. The heat was on and Elisa knew it. The next move she made would decide everything. She couldn't afford to be careless. But as the pressure mounted, she began to notice cracks in the case. The inconsistencies in the police reports, the discrepancies in the officers' statements. She was starting to unravel the truth, and it was worse than she had imagined. Elisa and Anna began poring over the documents in the early hours of the morning. They spent hours cross-referencing, searching for any shred of evidence that could expose the lies. With every passing day, Elisa grew more resolute. She was on the edge of a breakthrough. Her efforts were starting to pay off. During a quiet evening in her office, Elisa discovered something that would change the entire course of the investigation. A pattern of corruption that ran deeper than she had ever suspected. It wasn't just about one rogue officer. The corruption was systemic, ingrained in every layer of the police force. The realization hit Elisa like a thunderclap. If she exposed this, it wouldn't just bring down a few officers. It could shatter the entire justice system. It was a dangerous path, but Elisa couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He called Marcus. "I found something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something big." "Tell me," Marcus replied. "I'll send it to you," Elisa said. "But I need you to be careful. The stakes are higher now." As Elisa hit send on the email, she felt the weight of what she had just done. There was no turning back now. Exposing this would put her in even more danger, but she was prepared. The truth had to come out. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Anna. "Be careful. You're not alone in this, but trust no one." Elisa's blood ran cold. She had trusted so many, but who could she trust now? The days that followed the email to Marcus felt like they stretched on endlessly. Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every step she took, every phone call she made felt like someone was one step behind her. Her instincts, honed by years of navigating the labyrinth of law and power, told her that the walls were closing in. It wasn't long before Elisa's fears were realized. Late one night, as she was reviewing the evidence with Anna, her phone buzzed with an alert. Her work files had been accessed. The breach wasn't subtle. The timestamp showed it had occurred while she had been in a meeting. Someone was snooping around her digital world, looking for anything that could discredit her or derail her progress. Elisa quickly changed all of her passwords, but the damage had already been done. Whoever was behind this had access to everything. Emails, documents, the very heart of her case. The feeling of vulnerability was suffocating, and for the first time she felt truly alone. But then came the phone call that sealed it. Elisa's phone rang at 2 a.m. She knew better than to answer at this hour, but something in her gut told her to pick up. When she did, a cold, unrecognizable voice spoke into the receiver. "Elisa, we know what you found. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. If you want to keep your career and your life, you'll stop digging." The voice hung in the air, menacing, final. Elisa's heart raced, but she refused to let fear take control. They wanted to scare her, to make her feel weak, but Elisa knew that fear was just another weapon to control her. It was time to stop playing defensively. He had to strike back. After the call, Elisa spent the next several hours gathering her evidence, encrypting her files, and making a list of every ally she could trust. The stakes had been raised, but Elisa wasn't going to back down now. She had uncovered something far too important. No matter the cost, the truth had to come out. The pressure mounted with each passing day. Elisa knew she was playing a dangerous game, one that could cost her everything. But she also knew that if she let fear dictate her actions now, she would be complicit in the very system she was fighting against. Determined to make her move, Elisa decided to confront the root of the problem head-on. She arranged a secret meeting with a whistleblower from within the police force, a former officer who had witnessed the corruption firsthand and was ready to come forward with crucial testimony. The meeting was set for midnight at a quiet, inconspicuous cafe on the outskirts of town. When Elisa arrived, she noticed the officer sitting alone at a table in the far corner, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. The tension in the air was palpable as Elisa took a seat across from him. "I don't have much time," the officer said in a hushed tone. "But what I'm about to tell you, it's bigger than you think." He hesitated before continuing, his voice low and urgent. "I've been inside. I've seen how the system works, how they use fear, corruption, and manipulation to control everything. It's not just a few bad cops. It's an entire network. They've got people everywhere. Inside the government, the media, even other law enforcement agencies." Elisa listened intently, her mind racing. The officer's words confirmed everything she had suspected but also revealed a much larger operation than she had ever imagined. The corruption she was up against wasn't isolated. It was widespread, systematic, and entrenched in every level of power. "This isn't just about getting justice for you or for me," the officer continued. "This is about bringing down an empire built on lies. But it's dangerous. If you expose this, they'll come for you, your family, everyone." Elisa met his gaze, her resolve stronger than ever. "I understand the risks. But I'm already in this. And I won't stop until the truth is exposed." With that, the officer slid a folder across the table toward her. "Everything you need is in here. Be careful with it." As Elisa left the cafe, her heart raced, not from fear but from a growing sense of purpose. She had crossed a line now and there was no turning back. The truth was finally in her hands. But so was the weight of the consequences. The weight of the folder burned in Elisa's hands. It felt like she was holding the fragile thread that could either save or destroy everything she had worked for. The documents inside confirmed her worst fears: police corruption, collusion with criminal organizations, bribery, and a network that spread through every level of power. If she exposed this, the ramifications would be immense. But there was no more room for hesitation. She returned to her office late that night, her mind sharp, her body exhausted from the weight of the truth. Elisa opened the folder once more, scanning through the evidence with a sense of urgency. The clock was ticking. The people behind the corruption would do everything in their power to stop her, and the threats she had received were only the beginning. Before taking the final step of sending the information to the press and the authorities, Elisa met with Marcus. They arranged a secure location, ensuring no one could trace their movements. Marcus arrived early, his expression tight. He understood the gravity of the situation. "I've read the files," Marcus said quietly. "Elisa, this is bigger than we thought. You're about to change everything. But you need to understand, you're not just up against a few bad officers anymore. You're fighting an entire system that will do anything to protect itself." Elisa nodded, her face set in grim determination. "I know. But the people need to know. This is about more than just me. It's about every person who has suffered at their hands. I won't back down." With those words, Elisa sent the files to multiple news outlets and whistleblower organizations. It wasn't just a plea for justice. It was a call for an uprising against a corrupted system. The response was immediate. The media exploded with the revelation. News stations covered it endlessly. Social media was flooded with stories of victims, outraged citizens, and calls for reform. Elisa's name was everywhere, but so were the threats. Her safety was no longer guaranteed. Yet even as the danger mounted, Elisa felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The system that had hidden behind walls of secrecy was now crumbling. She had sparked something bigger than herself, a reckoning that had been long overdue. The night Elisa received the news that the police had finally arrested several key officers implicated in the corruption, she allowed herself a moment of relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start. The media was reporting arrests and investigations on a national level. People were demanding accountability, and the long-standing veil of silence had finally been pierced. However, as the investigation unfolded, Elisa realized the true scope of the battle ahead. The arrests were only the beginning. For every corrupt officer taken down, there were others waiting in the shadows, prepared to protect their interests by any means necessary. The system was powerful and it would fight back fiercely. But Elisa wasn't going to stop. The pressure, the threats, and even the danger had only solidified her resolve. As she sat at her desk that evening reviewing the latest updates, Anna called her. "We've won some battles, but the war isn't over," Anna said, her voice firm. "We have to stay vigilant. They won't stop. But you've given the people hope, Elisa. You've done more than anyone else ever dared." Elisa smiled bitterly. The truth is finally out, but the real fight is just beginning. In the following weeks, Elisa was in constant contact with her legal team, with the press, and with activists calling for continued reform. She had ignited a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The corrupt police officers who had been exposed were only the first wave of what would become a national reckoning. But despite the overwhelming sense of accomplishment, Elisa could never escape the looming presence of the forces still trying to silence her. They weren't just going to let her walk away unscathed. One night as she walked to her car, a black SUV pulled up beside her. The windows were tinted, and before she could react, two men stepped out, their faces masked, their intentions clear. Elisa's heart pounded in her chest as she recognized the danger too late. But just as quickly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Marcus. He tackled one of the men to the ground, knocking him out with a swift blow. The other man hesitated, then bolted, realizing the confrontation was not going as planned. Elisa stood there, breathless. "You came for me." Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow, his face serious. "You think they'd let you go this easy?" Elisa looked at him, then at the retreating figure of the second man. "No. But they've underestimated us." She got into her car, knowing the battle wasn't over. But now, Elisa was ready for the final stand. The truth had been exposed. The forces of corruption had been put on notice. And Elisa knew that no matter what came next, she had already won. Her fight for justice had just begun, and she would see it through to the end. As the dust began to settle, Elisa looked back on the long journey that had brought her here. The investigations, the threats, the late-night phone calls, and the silent moments of doubt. She had made enemies in high places, risked everything she had, and yet she stood victorious. The police corruption was no longer hidden in the shadows. It had been exposed to the light, with the arrests of key officers and the media's unrelenting coverage. People were talking, demanding accountability, and for the first time in years, the voices of those who had been silenced by the very system meant to protect them were being heard. But even as Elisa breathed a sigh of relief, she knew this was just the beginning. The system she had uncovered wasn't going to fall with just a few arrests. There would be more battles to fight, more truths to reveal, and more forces determined to silence her. However, Elisa no longer feared them. She had come too far, fought too hard. The truth had been revealed, and no matter what came next, she had sparked a fire that would burn brighter than any force that sought to extinguish it. The road ahead was uncertain, but Elisa knew one thing for sure. Her fight for justice would never end. As long as there was corruption, there would be those who stood ready to challenge it. And Elisa Martinez, once an unknown journalist, had become the voice of change. Her journey had only just begun.